Lexington Herald leader, major Kentucky bourbon maker Jim Beam, shutting distillery for 2026. Part of the story here is tariffs and Canada not buying whiskey within the United States.
Well, Canada has dropped its retaliatory tariffs on Kentucky bourbon.
American whiskey exports to Canada collapsed by 85% in a single quarter, dropping below $10 million for the first time on record. At the same time, Canadian provinces seized millions in US alcohol and removed major brands from government-run shelves. This report explains how tariffs triggered a cross-border shutdown that is reshaping bourbon markets, liquor pricing, and alcohol trade across America. Almost exactly 1 year ago, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced a new wave of tariffs on Canadian imports, reigniting economic tensions between two of the world's closest trading partners. Canada did not respond with tariffs on steel or cars. Instead, it went after something far more visible: alcohol. In Canada, liquor is not just sold by private companies. In most provinces, it is controlled by government-run monopolies like Ontario's LCBO, Quebec's SAQ, Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation, and BC liquor stores. That means provincial governments have the power to decide what stays on shelves and what disappears overnight. And that is exactly what happened. American-made wine and spirits were pulled from shelves, seized from warehouses, and frozen in transit. Unsold bourbon, whiskey, and California wine suddenly became political casualties. For consumers, it looked like a boycott. For producers, it felt like a shutdown. One moment made the crisis impossible to ignore. In Ontario, major importer Rogers & Company had over $1.5 million worth of prestige California wine seized by the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. We are talking about elite Napa Valley brands, bottles that were already sold, already shipped, and already meant for restaurant wine lists. Suddenly they were locked away in government warehouses. The company's managing director described the fallout as staff layoffs, office closures, and delivery workers put on reduced schedules. Across Canada, more than $100 million worth of American alcohol remains in government possession. For small US producers, the damage was even more personal. Todd Cavallo, a winemaker in New York's Hudson Valley, lost $10,000 in Canadian orders overnight, which was a massive blow for a small operation. He described having to take on outside work just to keep the business alive. Then came the data. In the second quarter of 2025, the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States released a report that stunned the global alcohol industry. American spirit exports to Canada plummeted 85%. Let that sink in. Exports fell below $10 million total, which is the lowest level ever recorded. At the same time, US wine exports to Canada dropped by as much as 94%. To understand the scale of that collapse, you need to know this. Canada has long been one of America's biggest buyers of alcohol. Ontario alone used to purchase nearly $1 billion worth of American alcohol every year. In 2024, 35% of all US wine exports went to Canada. Then, in just a few months, that market almost vanished. Chris Swanger, president of the US Spirits Trade Group, called the situation very troubling, warning that American producers were being hurt significantly by the breakdown in trade relations. Then came one of the most politically charged moves of the entire trade war. In British Columbia, Premier David Eby openly stated that the province would target red state American liquor, products from Republican-leaning states, as a way to apply pressure directly to the President of the United States and his political base. The idea was simple. If voters in bourbon-producing states like Kentucky started feeling the economic pain, then the pressure might travel back to Washington. Bourbon by law can only be made in the United States, and most of it comes from states that strongly supported Trump. That turned American whiskey into something more than a drink. It became a message. As American brands disappeared, something else happened. Canadian consumers adapted. Liquor stores put up signs reading, "Buy Canadian instead." And people listened. According to provincial sales data, Canadian whiskey and wine sales jumped over 24%. Ontario wine sales surged 56%. Nova Scotia saw local spirits rise by more than 24%. Bars and restaurants shifted their menus, and retailers promoted domestic brands, while holiday tastings in Toronto and Ottawa reported record-breaking sales of Canadian wine. For Canadian producers, the trade war became an unexpected opportunity. One Nova Scotia distiller described customers walking into stores asking a simple question: what is local? Back in the United States, the impact was rippling through Kentucky. The Bard Distillery, a small bourbon producer, had built strong momentum in Western Canada and expected the Canadian market to account for up to 20% of its sales. Then the boycotts hit. Expansion plans collapsed overnight, and the company's co-founder explained that every case matters for a small distillery, and suddenly entire shipments had nowhere to go. At the same time, tourism took a hit. Canadian visitors to the Kentucky Bourbon Trail dropped sharply, and New York's wine regions near the border reported fewer Canadian tourists who used to cross over for weekend tastings. The trade war was not just hurting exports, it was hurting entire regional economies. Industry leaders began using a powerful word to describe what was happening to American spirits in Canada: stigmatized. Not because the products themselves had done anything, but because they were caught in a political fight between governments. One California wine importer said the boycott was stigmatizing the entire category, telling consumers where to focus their resentment. Even Canadian retailers admitted the situation was emotional. Some customers were excited when US bottles briefly returned to shelves, while others refused to touch them at all. For many Canadians, buying alcohol had become a political choice. In December 2025, something unexpected happened. Several provinces allowed American alcohol back into stores, but there was a catch. The bottles were only being sold to clear expiring inventory, and the money raised would go to charity. Nova Scotia sold more than $2.2 million worth of American spirits in just 1 week. But the province's premier made it clear: once that inventory was gone, no new US orders would be placed. It was not a reopening. It was a farewell sale. Canada was not the only market pulling back. The US Spirits Trade Group reported that exports to the UK fell nearly 30%, and Japan dropped more than 20%. Together with Canada and the European Union, those countries make up 70% of America's international spirits market. For companies like Brown-Forman, the parent company of Jack Daniel's, sales to Canada alone dropped more than 60% in a single quarter. Executives warn investors that trade tensions were creating significant headwinds across their global business. Even if tariffs are lifted tomorrow, many experts believe the damage will not simply vanish. Canadian consumers have discovered local alternatives, and bars have rebuilt their wine lists, while importers are hesitant to risk shipments becoming unsellable again. An international trade professor in Nova Scotia summed it up this way: the relationship has changed. Buying American alcohol is no longer just about taste or price. For many Canadians, it is about loyalty. So here we are. An 85% collapse in exports. Millions of dollars worth of seized bottles. Bourbon distilleries losing key international markets. Canadian producers gaining ground at home. All because a bottle of whiskey became a bargaining chip in a trade war between two neighbors who used to be each other's closest customers. This is not just a story about alcohol. It is a story about how global politics can reach into everyday life, into your glass, your bar, and your local store. And as negotiations continue behind closed doors, one question remains: when the tariffs finally fall, will the shelves ever look the same again?